I'm joined by Alexander Downer, former Australian Foreign Minister, but more significantly, an advisor to the government on immigration policy, based, I think, Alexander, on the previous successes of the Australians in dealing with this problem. And in good time, I'll come to that. Yeah. To begin, do you honestly, really, truthfully think that we're going to scoop up thousands of young men from the beaches and from these dinghies in the Channel and detain them for 28 days in former army camps around the country, not allowing them to leave the premises, not allowing them to apply for any legal aid? Can you imagine the hoo-ha that would take place in this country from mainstream media, the fact that the Human Rights Act, ECHR legislation would be invoked very, very quickly? I mean, look, I'd love it to work, but do you really think it can?
Well, I think it can. Let me explain why I think it can. That you have a situation where the government has an agreement with Rwanda, and once they can start the process of sending people to Rwanda, then the people traffickers won't be able to sell their tickets, their passages any longer to people to come across the Channel, because they'll know that if they do come across the Channel, they'll be sent to Rwanda, so they'll stay in France,
if
right?
If that was to happen, of course.
So why would that... And the legislation, I mean, I've had a quick look at the legislation. I mean, I can't say I've read every word of it, but I've had a quick look at the legislation. I think the only problem, it's good, the legislation, the only problem is going to be this whole, which you allude to, this whole question of what the European Court of Human Rights does. So the government as a first step is going to engage in discussions with them. That's fair enough. They should have done that long ago. But they're going to engage in discussions with them to explain their position. But in extremis, they can legislate to say that under British law, in these particular circumstances, they will not be guided by the European Court. Now, they could do that. They haven't done it yet. Let
me pick up on both those points. Number one, Rwanda. You are prepared to take a few hundred people from us?
No, Rwanda have, and just checked this afternoon with the Home Office, Rwanda have not put a limit on the number of people they would take, and they could take a large number of people. But the argument here, which is a good argument, and this goes from my own experience dealing with the little island of Nauru, where we in Australia sent people, once the people traffickers know they can't get people into the UK, that they'll just be sent to Rwanda, the flood will turn into a trickle. So you won't need Rwanda to take tens of thousands of people.
That I accept. But the last time we looked at this, Rwanda were prepared to take a few hundred, and there was a clause in the agreement that in return we would have to take people from Rwanda into our country. So I'm not, I mean, look, if Rwanda want to take 10,000, probably 10,000 would stop it. Probably 10,000 would stop it. I'm not convinced.
Well, they've not put it. No, let me make this absolutely clear to the viewers. Rwanda have not put a ceiling on the number of people they would take.
Okay, fine. And then the idea that British legislation can override ECHR. The fact is, we're part of ECHR on an international binding treaty, and my experience of British judges is they will always rule in favour of international law over domestic law.
Yeah, I think this is a huge problem, and this goes back many years to the whole notion that the British Parliament has decided that foreign judges can have the ultimate say over British laws.
It's going to be a heck of a battle.
It's potentially a battle. So the question here, you and I don't know the answer to this. The question is, to what extent will the European Court decide to take on the British Parliament and, in effect, the British judiciary?
Well, I think they'd be only too delighted. Now, let's just remind people, I had a chat with Tony Abbott overnight, the Australian Prime Minister, who finally cracked it.
A very good man. John Howard first cracked it, by the way.
Yeah, and then it all went wrong.
Then Tony Abbott came and he fixed it again.
But Abbott made it clear to me that in the end, and you tried putting on people on the island and all the rest of it, but in the end, you simply towed the boats back to Indonesia. There was no agreement with Indonesia. There was international condemnation. People screamed and shouted. But guess what happened? the boats stopped coming,
Oh,
didn't they?
sure. And this is the argument that if you had an agreement with, look, all you need is President Macron, when he meets with Rishi Sunak on Friday, to say to Rishi Sunak, at Rishi Sunak's bidding, I will agree to you just returning these people to France. And the whole thing would be finished by sunset.
Yes, but I'm afraid...
The whole thing would be finished by sunset.
The chances of that aren't very high.
No, but let me just say, nobody here makes the argument about this. I think this is a really important issue. It's not in France's interests, as well as the UK's interest, that people are getting on and making these dangerous journeys and drowning in the English Channel. The French should be, and they surely are, totally opposed to this. And the best way to stop it is to agree to boat turnarounds. But if you do it unilaterally, the boat turnarounds have to happen in international waterways.
Well, the Royal Marines could pick people up on the 12-mile line and simply take them back to France.
Well, but there's no international water between France and the UK.
Well, there is a small separation zone, but it's a pretty narrow strip of water. Finally, Alexander, is today a step in the right direction?
Today is a big step in the right direction.
Yet another.
It's not, yes, yet another. It is true. Don't be so cynical.
Well, I'm sorry, I had the Nationality and Borders Bill last year. I was told that would solve everything.
Yeah, I do think you make a very good point, that let's be realistic about this. The Labour Party has opposed these measures all the way through. And if Labour become, as everybody says they're going to, become the next government, then it'll be a free-for-all across the Channel. There's no doubt about that.
It's been looking like one for the last 3 years, is how I would respond to that. Alexander Downer, thank you. Well, you've toughened up the government in their rhetoric, at least, which is a start. But I believe, folks, this is more about politics than anything else.